You can set up a boundary, and as you get close to that boundary with the controllers, it will bring up this sort of blue outline of a wall and outline of your boundary, but that obviously doesn't bring any information about an object that's in there or a person that has walked in there. So there's some issues there. A good question to ask is, well, the reason that we don't have any representations is that the technology isn't there in order for us to represent external objects into the virtual environment. And that isn't actually the case. The work at Disney by Pan and Neymar in 2017 has actually started investigating the possibility of integrating the real world and the virtual world. So as you can see in this GIF, there's a virtual ball that is represented in the virtual environment, and the real ball is associated with it. And we're able to see that ball in the real world and have to be represented in the person catch it in the real world, even though he's actually in the virtual world trying to get there. Currently, research is primarily focused on representing static objects in virtual environments, so things like cups and chairs, things that aren't dynamic and move like a person and sort of come in and out. And that's the research that you see in the bottom here. There's a cup in virtual environment, and he's able to grab it and pick up a real cup. So that's sort of where research is focused right now. My interest is more on notifying for dynamic things like a person in the room. So this leads me to the current study and the current research, or the research that has been sort of investigating thus far. This is by Ghosh et al. And colleagues in 2018, and they sort of looked at representing a person entering the room or a person talking to them, and they did this in the virtual environment. So their overall task was the participant was in a warehouse type environment. They had to find a ball and bring a ball to a specific location, and during that session, they would receive different modalities of notification for representing a person. And that was either visual, auditory, haptic, or paired combinations of all of those. And what they found while they were doing that is purely visual notifications suffered in notability across the board, so they were just the least likely to be seen and the least likely to be attended to. Haptic notifications, while noticeable, were found to be hard to discern their meaning, so they were told that a number of vibrations would be representing this kind of notification, and people often forgot and weren't able to count the number of vibrations while trying to do the task. Auditory notifications found to elicit the most feelings of urgency, so whenever they heard an auditory notification, they felt like they needed to respond to it as quickly as compared to some of these other modalities where they maybe felt they didn't have to attend to it as soon. And the auditory and visual notification combination were found to be the most popular for a person entering the room. So people seem to like those the best, seem to want those to be some of those aspects. So from that, they came up with some design recommendations that they suggested for people to use. So the first one is that you need to create distinctions such that external event notifications can be distinguished from virtual reality environments. My sort of point to that and sort of thought about that is game environments are constantly varied. There's a lot of different artistic styles, even in virtual reality that go into it. So how do we make a consistently distinct environment for all kinds of different games, all kinds of different aspects? So they just have that general recommendation, but don't really explain how to sort of achieve that. Their second is reducing visual search, such that the participant does not have to continually scan their virtual field or visual field to find a notification. So in their study, if there was a footsteps which would represent the person, if someone was not attending to that or looking at, that's how they would miss the notification. So games already do this fairly efficiently in terms of orientation devices. So if there's something happening off screen and you need to attend to it, there'll often be a rotating arrow that will point you to it, or rotating light that will point you to it. So having that as an integral part of alerting alerting and orienting someone to this person representation would be beneficial and sort of something that could be added to increase the effectiveness of visual notifications. Finally, they suggested using familiar metaphors, such as footstep sounds to indicate someone moving around. Again, games already usually employ this to notify you of a game environment of somebody behind you with footsteps or somebody with footsteps in the game. So being able to discern between them can be very difficult. So they might actually lead to confusion by having both. I would argue that footsteps would not actually be a good notification for someone to represent someone, since it can be often confused for in-game elements. So that brings us to my current study and what I currently looked at in the form of a survey. So the focus of this study was to sort of develop and test notifications based on these design recommendations and overall looking at what do people perceive as being a good notification for representing a person and what do people perceive as being a good notification for an orientation device. And then how does modality influence these perceived notification effectiveness? So how does that differ between visual, auditory, and a combined aspect of both of them? This is done in a survey form, and I'll talk about that, get into methods. Haptics were excluded because, again, this was done online, so it's hard to produce haptics online, and it was already found that it's hard to discern their meaning. Okay. So in terms of participants, we had 103 MTurk workers overall. 12 of them were eventually excluded due to careless responding analysis. And this was just done based on the survey completion time. The survey completion average time was about 20 minutes, maybe 21 minutes. Standard deviation was about 11 minutes. So anybody who fell below one standard deviation was excluded. So that would be about a 9-minute response time, which would be very quick. So 12 people fell under that. So we included 91 overall at the end, just to make sure that we weren't hitting people who were just kind of running through the In terms of developed notifications, we developed 30 different notifications broken down by modality. So there's 10 in each modality, 10 visual, 10 auditory, and 10 combination. And then further broken down by 5 within that. So 5 for representing a person in visual, 5 for representing an orientation device in visual, leading to 15 overall person and 15 overall orientation device. And up here we have kind of examples of some of the ones that were created. So this would be an example of an orientation device. It's an arrow. It sort of orients someone to where something is in the object. It doesn't specifically say what is in the environment. So it doesn't tell them that it's a person. It doesn't tell them that it's a dog or some other aspect that's already in the environment. Whereas this would be an example of a potential person notification. It sort of tells you what is and what is it. It should in theory be perceived as being a person. And all notifications were sort of developed to be as distinct as possible. So they're all done in sort of this white and black sort of aspect, sort of test on various backgrounds to see when that sort of breaks down in terms of distinction, in terms of different environments. But they're all created to be similar in this aspect. So for every notification, people saw the notifications. If it was visual, they saw what you guys saw, which was the box. If it was auditory, there was just an audio file that they had to play. And then if it was a combination, they received the visual and the audio file and were told to imagine these co-occurring at the same time when they played them. And they got these 3 questions for assessing effectiveness of this notification. So how would they rate this notification's effectiveness of grabbing their attention? It's on a 1 to 7 scale, with 7 being extremely effective and 1 being not at all effective. And then do they believe this notification is effective if it was intended to be an in-game alert? So obviously that's very important in trying to discern between an in-game and an external notification. If they think it would be a very good element for an in-game item, again on that 1 to 7 scale, that in theory would not be very good for an external event because it would be confused for an in-game item a lot of the time. So that's reverse coded, and then we have alert for something happening in the real world, so they think it would be good for a real world aspect, again on that 1 to 7 scale. So overall, we get into this, which there's a lot going on here, I understand, so we're going to kind of break it down. We're not going to talk about sort of everything. We're going to start here at the visual notifications. So these are all notifications I developed to be for a person, not an orientation device. What we find is that this orb notification, which I have on this next slide, this notification right here was the best notification for people visually, and they rated that as highly being just being good for an external event and not being good for an in-game event and being very attention grabbing. So it was rated as the highest overall in comparison to these other ones. And as I suspected, footsteps were rated as being among the worst for representing an external event and being for a person in an external event. So that kind of fits with that idea. Consistent with previous findings, overall visual notifications were just worse in comparison to auditory and visual and auditory, so they just performed holistically worse than the other 2. People just rated them, perceived them as being less effective than the other 2. The For moving on to the auditory, which is these light blue ones, the most effective notification was this person has entered the room, and that was literally just a file that said exactly that. It was just a person has entered the room, and that was perceived as being most effective for letting people know that the person was in the room, which makes sense. Interestingly, when we get down to this combination, it happened to be through random pairing or semi-random pairing that footsteps, which was among the worst, and the person has entered the room, which was the best audio, was paired together in the visual and auditory combination. And we find that that was rated as most effective. And overall, in terms of the effectiveness, it follows the exact same pattern as the auditory component. So if you look, person has entered the room, store door time, door opening, it follows the exact same pattern for the combination, suggesting that audio may be more important in perceived effectiveness than the visual aspect for these notifications, and we'll put more weight on the audio, which is why when we get it paired with the worst visual, the best audio, we get that being as perceived as the best because that was the best audio overall. So there might be this aspect to put more weight in terms of the combination. So then we get into the orientation notifications. Again, breaking it down by each one individually. We get to the visual, which is in the red. And if we look at text box was the best visual orientation notification. And the text box looked like this, very similar to the auditory side of a person has entered the room. Now this would be considered an orientation device because it would be pointing you based on the end of this box where you would go. So it would appear and it would be telling you where you would go, but it doesn't actually physically represent a person. There's no like the orb, which was a representation in the environment of a person. However, I suspect that people are not comprehending that in the way that I had intended it to be, so they might be confusing that with actually being a person representation. So further breakdown by how people are comprehending these notifications, which I have. I just wasn't able to do all of that for this presentation. So breaking it down by how participants thought about the notifications may be important. But if we sort of ignore that, we find a similar pattern for the visual and auditory notifications that we saw in the last one, where the rotating light and the visual was paired with the EAS tone, which was the best auditory, and we find that being among the most effective in terms of visual, in terms of the combined notifications. Again, suggesting that maybe auditory components are weighed more heavily in terms of perceived effectiveness in these notifications that I developed. Overall, again, visual just performed worse compared to the other two, but interestingly, there was a significance here. So visual and auditory notifications were significantly better than just auditory alone, suggesting that in terms of an orientation device, it would be beneficial to have both as compared to a person. It might just be okay to have an auditory component. So overall, the most effective notifications were those that directly stated notifications to the person. So an orb of the text box that stated the person that entered the room, same for the auditory equivalent. Audio and visual and combined notifications were best overall, and auditory notifications may compensate for visual ones. Footsteps in this way may be a good notification only in the context of an additional auditory cue. So for the directions, as I already stated, is sort of looking at the comprehension of these notifications for each individual and sort of seeing how they break down between person and orientation and analyze it that way. Obviously, these are all just perceptions, so physically testing these ideas and see if people's perceptions match up with how they actually perform with these notifications. And then final sort of an advanced one is how intrusive are these notifications to gameplay, and also what level of intrusion is sort of appropriate for this. A lot of people play VR to be immersed, and so they don't want to be notified of everything that's happening in their environment. So what level of intrusion would be important, and how does this sort of change, and how does it need to change as the game develops and becomes more intense for that individual, so they are still notified. Yeah, that's it.
So on that last point, the how intrusive should it be? It's probably going to be less intrusive than hitting somebody or running into a wall.
Right.
That's sort of your baseline.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good point.
On that same line of talking about intrusiveness, as when you listen in your future directions, is when you look at it, are you going to consider also? So let's take footsteps or that sort of notification in an area where that would be a frequent occurrence. Is that measured in intrusiveness as well? Just the amount of the frequency in which I would be notified of if it's something that would happen really in the environment that I'm
Yeah.
in the real world environment where I'm
Right, so you're continually hearing or seeing the footsteps because people are coming in and out.
right.
Does that change the level of intrusiveness that we feel of it?
Kind of like it's just how does that fit in intrusiveness in the way you like to research?
So I think that would definitely impact intrusiveness. So notification that people think would be effective but not intrusive, that hear it one time, but then they hear it 50 times. Obviously, that changes, and they might become more annoyed by that notification because they heard it over and over again, and therefore that would make it more intrusive, and that would change it. So that's an interesting question to sort of look at repetitiveness of this notification, and how does that change intrusiveness values as well.
Have they ever looked at, or you, I guess, are curious in the idea of doing like modality of that compared to what people would like prefer to have in different types of video games? So is there a difference in the most effective one and that people would prefer to have a specific type?
So there has sort of been research that looked into it. Again, the last study was saying that people prefer visual and auditory, but didn't actually give a whole lot on in terms of effectiveness. So that would be something that I would also be interested in looking at is that exact question.
So you raised both questions I had. So it's interesting to look at this in terms of how load might impact the effectiveness, but in regards to finding the appropriate level of intrusiveness, have any studies, to your knowledge, examined the relationship between these types of alerts and ratings of presence?
That is a good question. I do not know offhand if there has anything that has looked at presence and ratings of intrusiveness. I'm sure that there is. I just have to go for that question specifically. It seems like that would be out there. Okay. I'll take that.
I'm just gonna hold up so you know that's.
No.
Can you see this? Can you see this? Or is that too
No,
light?
I'm not gonna be able to see it.
Alright. I'll just hold up like 5.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, this is the one.
I was curious.
Does anyone want any coffee before we start?
Wow, thanks HFS for bringing that.
So my name is Michael Wilson. My advisor is Dr. Jing Fang, and for this year, I studied the matrix effect in virtual reality. So what is the matrix effect? Really good question. I'm glad you asked. I'm still trying to figure that out myself. But it is the perceived slowing down of the environment accompanied by the speeding up of thoughts. Now, it's believed to occur in highly stressful or dangerous situations. Interestingly, Noyes and Colletti in 1976 and 1977, they interviewed people that were in car accidents, train accidents, motorcycle accidents, and they found that 64 out of 85 participants in 1976 reported time slowing down during accidents, and 1977 that 73 out of 101 people reported time slowing down in accidents. Okay, So, Stetson Fiesta and Eagleman in 2007 attempted to reproduce this effect by dropping people from a 150-foot tower in an amusement park known as a SCAD, which is a suspended catch air device. And while they were, before they started, the participants were wearing a perceptual chronometer. And what that is it's an LED array that flashes between the negative image of the number and the positive image of the number. So the rationale for doing this is that if time actually does slow down for people, you would expect to see an increase in temporal resolution. Okay, so they had 20 participants, and all of them, on average, reported time slowing down by 36% using duration estimations. So duration estimation is just an accuracy judgment. So you have an objective measure of time, how long it took them to fall, which was, I think, 2.73 seconds. And they give you, at the end, they give you a judgment, a duration judgment. It took 5 seconds, it took 10 seconds, whatever it is. And then you compare those two, and that's your accuracy judgment. So that's what a duration estimation is. It's used quite a bit in traditional time perception research, which this is not. The interesting thing was that none of the participants could see the numbers flashing on the screen, all right? So their conclusion was that this was just a memory effect, all right? But Arstilla in 2012 criticized this study, saying that memory effects don't really take into account why these fabrications of memory would take place in the first place, or why they would sometimes have causal relevance. So you hear a lot of times anecdotal evidence, especially in skydivers, especially with the wingsuit community coming out, that something goes wrong in the accident, or there's an accident, something goes wrong, and time slows down for them, and all of a sudden they remember to pull their reserve chute or something like that. Now that could be a function of expertise, we don't really know yet, but these are one of the criticisms to that study. Costella, Sands, and Castillo tested mountain climbers on a via ferrata. A via ferrata is a designated mountain climbing route that's filled with iron pegs, rungs, ladders, and ropes. So for people who haven't done it before, I suppose it's pretty scary. What they found using the SAM test, which was a self-assessment mannequin test, it's a pictorial test that measures valence, arousal, and dominance. They found that was associated with longer duration estimates and passage of time judgments. Now, passage of time judgment compared to a duration estimation is an experience of how you perceive time to flow, right? It's the phenomenological side of it. So for instance, while you were listening to Aaron, 15 minutes had gone by, and you might report that 15 minutes had gone by, but you could also say that it felt like it took longer. Concomitantly, Aaron, being up here, would probably say that it took 15 minutes or 16 minutes or whatever it was, but it felt like it went by very quickly. Okay, so that's a passage of time judgment, the feeling of time moving. And passage of time judgments is what we're actually getting at. Okay, so Jones et al. In 2007 found that stimuli was perceived by click trains. What? Oh, found that the stimuli that was perceived by click trains both increased the subjective time, so duration estimations, and directly increased information processing in recall and recognition tasks. Interestingly, Treisman in 1990 suggested that click trains may increase arousal, thus making time go by more slowly. Now, this was never actually studied. It was just a speculation. So there's not a whole lot of research on slow motion phenomenology itself. Most of it is what you've already seen. But all of this research has pointed to arousal as being essentially the main predictor of slow motion phenomenology and performance. Okay, so since the IRB is not going to let me, throw people off a 150-foot tower anytime soon, I said to myself, could we do this in VR? And so this was actually already done for us. Calvert and Tan in 1994 and Vandenberg in 2017 demonstrated that you can manipulate arousal in virtual reality. Okay, but our biggest question was, can it produce sufficient enough arousal to induce slow motion phenomenology? So our main hypothesis, for the purposes of this presentation, was that physiological arousal and subjective arousal will predict performance on a word fragmentation test. So we used a heart rate monitor for physiological arousal, and we used the SAM test like I did in Costello et al. In 2017 from the Via Ferrata to measure subjective arousal. And so I collaborated with Aaron Croson and Zach Pugh, and we got together, and to Zach's credit, he made this amazing cityscape with, where we manipulated arousal using height, and through trial and error, we got to where we thought we could get something interesting. All right, so what did we do? First, we had 7 females and 7 males with a mean age of 19 years old and a standard deviation of 1.3. They had to have no history of claustrophobia or motion sickness, had to be a current student at NCSU, or current student, right? Okay, good. We compensated 1 credit per half hour per unit. All right. They used the Oculus Rift headset and touch controllers, and like I said, we used a Polaris 7 heart rate monitor. Now, we specifically chose the Polaris 7 heart rate monitor because it had the highest correlation between all heart rate monitors that were tested in a validation study between the Nike Fitbit, the Apple Watch, and another chest monitor. Had a correlation with an electrocardiogram of 0.996. So we thought that would be sufficient enough. Plot twist. All right, so the first thing they did was they signed a consent form, and then we took a baseline heart measurement. So we sat them down, had them relax, and that's where we took the heart rate measurement. The next thing they did was don the equipment, and then we gave them 3 control tasks, which was similar to the low arousal task. Okay, so basically on these 3 control trials, they were walking on different parts of the sidewalk. In the middle of each task, they were given a set of words indexed by a crosshair in the middle of the screen for 300 milliseconds, which was commensurate to the Jones and Weirden study in 2011. After that, they were given a low arousal task, similar to the control conditions, a medium arousal task, which is them going from the sidewalk up to an elevator, where they reach the top of a 110-meter tall building. And then they're asked to go from one part of an I-beam to the other building, crossing the I-beam. All right. In the high arousal task, they're asked to come back across that I-beam, where in the middle of it, they would fall to their death. So that was our manipulation for the suspended catheter device. These were also counterbalanced between control and experiment. So some people did the experimental first and some did the control first. After each trial, so there were 6 trials in total, they were given the self-assessment mannequin test. The RA or myself would write down their maximum heart rate for each of the trials, and they were given a word fragmentation completion test. All right, so this is what the SAM test. This is what the SAM test looks like. Okay, this is valence, arousal, and dominance, and this is the word fragmentation completion test. So, like I said before, the words would flash on the screen, and afterwards they would have to fill in these words. And the idea here, excuse me, the idea here is priming. If they actually saw the words, they would be more likely to get these words correct. We put all these in, we put the heart rate gain, which was the difference between their baseline and their maximum heart rate, and their subjective arousal based on the self-assessment mannequin test into a regression. We did find significant regression, which was amazing because it's like the first significant results I've got since my undergrad year. So that's wonderful. Had a very small effect though, R squared at 8%. Using SPSS, we calculated the unstandardized predicted value to plot this. Now, the problem is that we had a very small effect size. One of the reasons that I think we had a small effect size is that in 1994, Calvert and Tan just only demonstrated that you could manipulate arousal in virtual reality, and they used a heart rate monitor for that, right? But other studies suggest that measuring arousal simply using heart rate is probably not the best idea. Better ways to measure it would be galvanic skin response, heart rate variability, and pupil dilation, or a combination of all three. In future studies, we would also like to create a more immersive and interactive environment, which we'll be working on and replicating this summer. And we'd also like to move to task-relevant stimuli instead of just flashing words, to move toward actual application. So if this is real and if it can increase performance, that's something we want to know, and hopefully we can move it towards other domains. And that's basically it. Are there any questions? Yes.
So, going forward with this and creating a more immersive environment, are you going to implement any of those other measures you mentioned, such as skin conductance, into the future study?
Yes, we're looking into a heart rate variability monitor. I actually didn't know that we had one. I think the social department has one, so we're going to see if we can use that and get a better measure. We're also going to try and find a way to hook up the pupil labs. Eye thingy. What's it called? Eye tracker.
There is an adapter for that, and then if you want to utilize skin conductance, after
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to focus. Yeah.
Do they have a respiration rate measure for that, or has the heart rate variability monitor do?
We didn't check. But that's a good idea because usually when people use heart rate variability, they also take into account respiration. Any other questions?
Can you link it back to time perception from word fragmentation?
Yes, we will. And we actually did, but in the interest of time, we didn't put that in here. So we got both duration estimates and passage of time judgments. And when we put everything into the model passage for these specific participants, passage of time judgments did actually negatively predict performance on the word fragmentation test, which was super interesting. But like I said, as far as the heart rate goes, I don't know, or rather, I'm sorry, the immersiveness. Once we create a more interactive environment and it's more immersive, that could change.
So did there,
So why did you pick the word fragment completion task? Because it's a task it's an implicit memory task. Were you trying to get measures of implicit memory?
The basic idea was priming, so in a way, yes, but we really couldn't figure out the best way to do it. So we were thinking about just using bases, but we thought that maybe that would be too salient. We didn't have any other thing else to go by, really. With the exception of flickering stimuli.
when you were discussing the early experiment with the numbers flashing, I was expecting it to go where they couldn't explicitly remember it, but then maybe they could implicit, you said you had forced choice, that they would have said, oh, well, I didn't see it, but I'm gonna pick 4, and that they'd be likely to be right.
They actually did do that.
Okay. Did they find that?
No.
Oh.
And I was actually.
So that was the difference between our study and theirs.
So was that task like a chronometer, like a watch, or was it
Yeah,
something?
it was-
that could-
No, it was attached to the wrist and it was, think of like a very big watch.
Yeah.
With, had 9 LED arrays.
And if I'm falling from a building, I'm probably not checking the time.
Yes. Oh, well, they actually, they had, Dr. David Eagleman suspended on top, and they would watch people as they fell, so people that closed their eyes, they would take out of the study.
But could it be an intentional effect? I mean, that'd be a good argument.
It could be.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of stuff, like, the problem with arousal is like, you can't, there's some ethical constraints in like terrifying people, and, you know, so this stuff is intrinsically difficult to control. I actually sent him an email, ask him how he got the IRB to approve it, because I wanted to model mine, and he sent me 2 words, a miracle, signed Dr. David Eagleman. Wasn't gonna wait around for that.
So the significant effect you did find was for heart rate, right? So the increase in heart rate, for.
No, that was negative as well, so it was a decrease in heart.
Decrease in heart rate and that's the opposite of what you predicted?
Yes.
Interesting, okay. And.
Well, like I said, we don't actually know, maybe just, seeing the change in heart rate from baseline to max is maybe not the best way to go about it.
And if it stops, that will make it negative.
That's
good.
But so the conditions were the same too for everybody. It was they started low, medium, high. Would you consider counterbalancing conditions in the future? Has that been discussed, or is that?
We did counterbalance control and experimental conditions. So some people did the experimental condition first, but they were all in order.
Yeah.
Some people did the control, but they were all in order. Now, we wanted to bridge the purpose of this specifically was to bridge the gap between experimental studies and observational studies, and we thought VR would be a really good way to do that. But there still needs to be, we wanted to keep some reality, so you don't fall off a building first and then go back up and cross an ID.
And then the other idea I had for you for the future was I don't know if you had thought about any other kind of like arousal condition, like anything else to increase sympathetic activity that doesn't revolve around terrifying or like sexually arousing people. Like maybe like I think like maybe something like a simpler like change, like perceptual change maybe to.
Well, my previous research used it turns out that when you're in flow, your arousal tends to increase too. So we could do things like beginners versus experts and see where that leads us to. There are many different ways to measure arousal.
Yeah.
But as far as this research is concerned, we kind of wanted to model our research based on what had already happened. So it wasn't like all the way on the exploratory side, you know.
12:37.
Whatever.
Just hit the flashing.
Yeah,
Line.
it's muted. There you go.
Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Stacy, and today I'm going to be talking about part 1 of a project that's looking at mental models and expertise using video games. And so, first off, I want to kind of give you a synopsis of this project in general before we kind of get into the description. So this is a knowledge elicitation study. As I said, it's part 1. So one way to look at mental models is to give participants concepts and they rate them on their similarity. And this way we are able to estimate essentially which concepts might be closer related to each other versus ones that are a little bit farther. But, so we are interested in looking at those relationships at one point, but that's what we say for part two. For part one, we're really only interested in looking at the concept terms. What are these concept terms within multiplayer online battle arena style games, which I'll start referring to as MOBA from now on. So the goal of this study is to develop a database of MOBA concepts for use in future mental model studies, so that's part two. The method that which we use, we grabbed MOBA communities and Overwatch for comparison, and had them complete a concept elicitation task online using Qualtrics. And right now, data is currently ongoing, so I only have a brief data preview at the end, so we're not able to make any conclusions from that data preview. So let's take a step back and start from the beginning. So what are mental models and kind of the characteristics, and then we'll jump into kind of what the project is in general. So mental models are these internal representations of the outside world. You can consider them visualization of how information may be organized, and it gives us insight into human behavior and decision making by visualizing how that information is clustered together and may be connected to associated concepts. Sorry about that. So if you can think about it in the sense, for example, actually let's just go on, sorry about that, pause. So mental models, some characteristics about mental models is that, again, they are these organized internal representations. They pull information from your accumulated knowledge from long-term memory, so they store knowledge, and they bring them up to working memory where you're able to basically describe, explain, and predict phenomena within the domain. And you're able to use that to make these quick inferences and decisions. They're dynamic in the sense that they function on the basis of expertise as you experience life, gain skills, that sort of thing. They change to accommodate that new knowledge. And they've been shown to be indicative of performance and expertise. And so why study mental models is basically that last note, is that they're predictive of this performance and expertise. And by understanding how these structures changes as a function of expertise, we can really define what it is to be an expert by comparing what is it that experts have that maybe novices don't in their mental model. And so taking a look a little bit at some of the literature that's out there before, I've said that I was indicative of performance. And so in human-computer interaction research, they've noted that completeness of a model was predictive of human interaction and behavior. So depending on how that mental model was structured, they were able to see things like how they might search for items using like a search bar, or even how their eyes might move with an interface, predicted task performance, that usually those who had more complete models perform better, and also were able to predict learning. And in regards to expertise, previous research has shown that there are structural characteristics based off of your level of expertise, which we'll get to in just a moment. So Dr. Furlow and Dr. Gillen had a beautiful table in their paper, their 2018 paper, which I adapted here. Unfortunately, mine is not as legible as theirs in their paper, but what I really want you guys to be able to get from this is that experts just behave differently than novices. They organize their information in such a way that we should be able to see the differences in these models. So how do we even begin to start to measure what's inside and bring it forth? So we use something called knowledge elicitation, which is a subcomponent of knowledge acquisition, which knowledge engineers use to maybe build these expert systems. And so Cook kind of defines them or puts them into kind of two categories. There's this naturalistic way of doing it with interviews, where you might interview people to kind of get what those domain concepts are and their relationships. It's a long process and usually has a smaller sample because of the cost in doing such an interview. And then it's natural because experts naturally would describe whatever X domain using kind of the natural jargon that they would, how you and I would speak in an interview. A contrived one, it's considered contrived because they're comparing these concepts to each other and how I described earlier, these similarity ratings. So it's something that has to be taught to the expert. It's not necessarily natural, but it's very fast to apply, which would make it really easy to put online, to create a database for online. So introducing one of the problems. So how do you even begin to get the concepts? So one way you can get the concepts is by looking at manuals. You can get the manuals and then get those concepts to give to the participants, and they do a similarity rating. Another way is to get experts, but the problem is when you elicit from usually these subject matter experts, they're usually small populations. These experts are difficult usually to access and even to say who is really truly an expert. Their time is often expensive, and even when you do elicit these concepts from these subject matter experts, the terms might not necessarily generalize to other types or levels of expertise. And so our suggestion is to use multi-online battle arena style games as a platform to address some of these issues with mental models. So they have a readily available pool of participants in the millions, and they also have predefined measures of expertise based on how you play. And if for those who are not familiar with multi-online battle arena style game, it's an action real-time strategy video game where one person is in control of one character in a usually 5-person team, and they're competing against another 5-person team to try to destroy their home base. And so they have to work collectively as a group together in order to accomplish that. So there's not a lot of research out there in regards to mental models expertise in MOBAs. One study here is Furlow and Gillen 2018 that found structural differences by expertise using League of Legends. And so one of the things that when I was reading this paper is what I wondered was, what about other MOBAs? And the reason why I'm curious about other MOBAs is that MOBAs share a lot of similarities with each other. They all pretty much have this main objective, destroy the enemy base. There's usually that dynamic controlling one character in a usually 5 versus 5 team. And their map layout is very similar. There's like usually one side is base, the other side is the enemy base, and there's certain lanes that are very similar as well. Character role archetypes, non-player characters that come into play to try to attack you, and also the gameplay that you look at. As you can see, it's this bird's eye view. So my thought was that if they're so similar, we might see these similarities and structural differences by expertise across MOBA. So the idea or the plan for this project as part one is what are the terms, because there's a lot of jargon in video games. So we want to really classify what are the jargon specifically for Dota 2 or a specific MOBA, and then maybe the jargon for another one, and maybe how thematically do they cross together? Are there some similarities there? So we're just wanting to outline what are the terms. In the second part, we're hoping to do a pathfinder analysis and find out what the relationships are between the terms so that we can at one point answer, are there structural characteristics associated with expertise? And if so, are these differences consistent across the MOBA genre, or are they very game specific? So research design. So the questions for part one is honestly, what are the terms? Some things that we don't really have any hard hypothesis right now. We have an assumption that there will be differences by expertise based off the literature. So are there associations between term types and expertise? And again, with game types, they're fairly similar across the genre. So one of the things we expect is that we might see similarities in MOBA game types versus a non-MOBA game. So are there similarities in themes across MOBA game types versus non-MOBA? And so what we did is we investigated 4 communities, 3 of the most popular MOBAs, Dota 2, League of Legends, and Heroes of the Storm, and then 1 non-MOBA, Overwatch, that has MOBA qualities in their characters. And this was used as a similarity. Our goal was to obtain 80 to 200 participants with recent experience playing one of the games in a competitive setting, 18 years or older, and a US resident. And this was just specifically for youth. And then this is the flow of the experiment. So we placed the Qualtrics survey online and posted it on relevant gaming communities on Reddit. And so they would do one of the gaming, like one game at a time, and they would get a concept elicitation task. And so the concept elicitation task that we chose was a chapter listing task. And so they would go in, list the number of chapters they think they could make about said game. So let's say Dota 2. They would list the number of chapters and list the chapter titles. They would go then write a sentence description about that chapter, and then had 2 minutes to list as many concepts underneath that as they could. And then afterwards, they were given just general demographics, some questions relevant to game type, like their rank, hours played, etc., general and video game use. And so what we're hoping to do, we're still coding at the moment, but what we're hoping to do is we'll take participants' responses and we'll be able to put them into something that's game specific and then something that's overarching. So as you can see, like the bottom row would be maybe some participants' responses for Overwatch. And these are all characters that are Overwatch support characters, and on the far left is Dota related support. We would be able to merge them up into one thing of support that's common against across the MOBA. And so again, the end results for this is to address previous limitations, because the concept would be elicited from a large sampling varying expertise, answer research questions, what are the terms, if there's association between the terms and expertise, and if there's similarity across the MOBAs. And then more specifically, we would be able to use these in future studies, almost like standardized terms or standardized concepts. So part 2 is the one that I outlined, but technically these concepts can be used in any mental model research that's investigating expertise within those 4 communities. And so our data preview, so initially we had 454 people who were interested, and there was an immediate dropout of like, yes, I am interested, and then 285 were like, nope, that's on. And then 39 were taken out for failure to follow directions, so that's kind of inappropriate responses that we got, kind of typical for online trolling, I guess, if you will, examples. So we're going to be working with, and then bundled into the 130. So at one point, we're hoping to actually look at that 130, but for this data preview, we only included those 81 who actually completed the study, and that we had rankings. For the 130, there's 49 people that we don't have rankings, so we're trying to figure out what we want to do with them in the meantime. So gender, it's mostly male, which is also very typical. If I don't have the game distribution, but if we look at where the females are, they're in Overwatch, which is actually pretty typical, again, of that community, because there's more female players or characters and representation in that community. So again, kind of typical. And then the gender age distribution, they're mostly 18 to 24, and then 25 to 54. We don't have much older gamers in our population. And so if we break it down by expertise, we have mostly intermediate and expert, so we're really significantly missing that novice piece. But if you look at our numbers, they're very small. So we have not hit our quota there yet. And so hopefully as we get more data coming in, we'll be able to have a more representative sample. And if you look at game type, we were interested in MOBAs, and unfortunately the one community that decided to reply was the Overwatch community, which is also a little bit telling of their community, since they tend to have less toxicity than MOBA games. So we're hoping that we can distribute the survey to other online forums so that we can get a little bit more of the MOBA data area as opposed to Overwatch. But we're pretty much done with Overwatch collecting. And then if we break it down by hours played, most people fall into the 2-hour range, so there's no one like super crazy out there that's playing a lot of video games for a long time. And I think that probably the most important aspect is that our intermediates and experts are playing longer and our novices, while they still fall into that 2-hour, they're not going into something for their 4 or 5 hour gameplay. And this is hours played a day. And so if we look, we break down those chapter listings that they had initially did before. There's the average by expertise here. So the vertical here is the number, and then here is the expertise, and on the other side it's the same except for game type. And so they all seem to be fairly similar in how many chapters they're listing, but their standard deviations are pretty big. And again, if you look at that end, it's not really fair to make comparisons between like 39 intermediates and 7 novices. Or on the opposite side, 49 Overwatch and 7 League. So hopefully as more data comes in, we can make a better average chapter listing. Right now, we are still coding our concepts, so I don't have any coming themes for you at the moment. But hopefully next time I present this, I will. Some limitations of the study. So we had about a 37.7 attrition rate from that 131 to 82. So that the concerns on that is that there might be a limited sample. This isn't a really representative sample of so many people are dropping out, and that the responses that we do have are fatigued. So we might try to see if we can make amendments somewhere to better support the user response. In addition, we do have open responses because we want them to be able to generate as much as possible. But because of that, there's a high variation in responses, with some people just giving us concept word versus like phrases. And even some people writing huge chapters. So it's like, what do we keep? What do we consider a concept? So there's more research interpretation there, which is the concern. So we're hoping that by doing some triangulation of researchers, we can limit our own bias into how we break apart what is a concept or how this concept fits into a theme. And again, I think probably amendments aim to support user response. And then another limitation that is actually probably more of a future study is that this is an international phenomenon. And we only included US participants for ease of IRB because currently our IRB is having some difficulties. And so trying to get international responses as well might have been a little bit difficult. But will these terms be really reflective if we include the international presence? If we don't include the international presence is what I'm trying to say. Because, for example, the Dota 2 main competition is called the International. And another example is that even our North American qualifiers for Dota 2, our top team, has only one member from the United States, and that person is a sit-in. So it's a we're not necessarily the contenders in this sport. And I guess the next part of this is going to be doing that second part is trying to do that, finding those relationships. And that's it. Yes.
Can you quickly explain what chapter and title and that stuff means? I don't know if I'm just like not understanding what a video game reference is or.
Yeah, chapter, so basically we wanted them to elicit concepts. So it's just almost a metaphor for how they're able to speak. Instead of saying like, list as many concepts as you can about X topic, it's more facilitating like, okay, think of a chapter heading. So say like, for example, in this would be maps, right? And then they would talk about map structure in those games. And then the concepts would be more like anything related, like lanes and all that stuff.
Okay.
Yes.
Can you explain how you determine experts? I don't know if you
Oh, I just did not have a slide on that, I
It's
do
okay.
apologize. So the way we did experts is we used the predefined rankings for each of the systems. We actually have, we broke it down by the percentage, so we had like about, I wanna say the top 10 was the experts, and then the bottom 24% were novices, and anything in between those two numbers is intermediate. And we basically looked at everybody's distribution, because each game has a different one, and we put everybody's rank that fell within kind of that distribution. And we're like, okay, since you're this rank and you fall, and in this game it falls under like the 24% of that distribution, we put them in novice.
Is that for competitive play, competitive rank?
Mhm.
Okay, and is that, did you base it on like also hours played? And also if you did do hours played, is that per like so many hours played in MOBAs and then so many hours played in just RPGs in general, or?
So we do have, we use the green values like general use of video games. We haven't gone through that to look at it, mostly out of time purposes. I was like, we will do that at the other time. But we do have that information. We're mostly basing the ranks though on that predefined like ranking system for that. So they're an expert here. We do have some collection of kind of skill acquisition, whether they go out on their own to look at coaching videos or like hire a coach, because some people hire coaches in this game and that sort of thing. So we're hoping to look at those answers as well. I hope, does that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay. Anybody else? Yes.
So you acknowledge that you have sort of a limitation with having a large amount of intermediate and expert users. I wonder if that's because of your sampling method of going through Reddit, there's not likely to be many novices or so dedicated to, sign up for a specific community that way. So in the future, how do you plan to incorporate additional novices in your sampling methodology?
Good question. We're still at the moment trying to figure out which populations that we want to do. We might do some of the forums that are online for specifically for the game. So like when we look up Overwatch, they have specific forums and seeing how they might do it. Maybe even just doing an enter and seeing if like, do you fall under this rank specifically? So we're still trying to figure that question out for the future cases.
If you noticed in the Furlow and Gillen research, we didn't do novices, we did low, medium, and high experience, because for that reason, you can't really find true novices. And they wouldn't really be able to, it wouldn't be meaningful for them to say what the relationship between two concepts of something that they don't know about. So you may want to just try to get low experience.
Low experience.
If you're looking for an individual who's never played a video game, you're a girl.
A unicorn.
Yeah.
Here we are.
Yeah.
Now let's make a dozen of you. There's a cloning machine somewhere. Anybody else? Yes.
As in addition to that, actually, that made me think, on some official forums, they have a specific post that says new users come here. So that might be a way of just finding people who would be quote unquote novices.
Would be a good one. Hopefully, the only concern is if they're new users and they don't have a rank yet, is that they're not going to be able, as Dr. Dillon said, to make these association terms, because they're pretty much meaningless.
Yeah.
And so that's why we broke it up from that distribution, because that distribution exists for each of the games, and there's always someone on the low end. You don't want to be there. You want to be more on the platinum and Arc Divine level, but someone has to make up that part of the distribution. So we're hoping we can find usually those distributions. We just haven't figured out where they're at. Yes.
I can ask you later.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm thinking Overwatch again. So when you say the ranking system, I know people who can just make an account right quick, level 25, and they are in say platinum because they have really good technical skills. So they may not have that many hours on the game, but they're still really, really high technical skilled players. Do you consider that, or do you also consider time invested in the game and they may not be as high ranked?
So we have that information, we just haven't looked at it, so I can't.
Okay, but you did consider,
We do,
Okay.
we
You'd
are
probably be a
considering.
novice. so.
I was just,
We just haven't put it together.
sorry.